Welcome to Tech Tuesday. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept of running a gauntlet, but that's what we do every time we prosecute a patent. So what happens? We write a patent, and maybe we use one of those mindsets I talked about a few weeks or months ago, like a castle, exploration. And now what happens to the patent? What happens to the patent is people start beating it up. Some prior outcomes. The law changes. You make a bad argument. You're forced to compromise with the examiner. The client changes his design. Maybe somebody does some inequitable conduct. Bottom line, the quality of the patent keeps on going down. You start off with this wonderful broad patent, and you lose, and you lose, and you lose, and you lose, and maybe you get something small. And there are many cases with the patent that we get, if the client would have known that that's all the patent he would get, he would never have filed it. Luckily, of course, by the time we get it, we know that it has value. Now, this is a concept of running a gauntlet, and you see a picture here from, I think it's a Prussian army or something like that. Basically, this guy did something bad. Here's a soldier with a sword pushing him forward. All of his friends are waiting here in 2 rows, and as he goes by, they beat him with a stick. And if he makes it through the other end, it's good. And if he doesn't make it through the other end, he's dead. Okay, and that's exactly what you might think happens to a patent. Okay, get a rejection, turns out you don't have support, turns out it doesn't work anymore, and so on. So one might think that patents do not age well. So what I want to talk about is what metaphor can we use when we talk about prosecution, office actions and so on, which will help us make decisions. And a concept I want to bring up to you is athletes. When an athlete is preparing for the Olympics, there's a battle between 2 separate processes. Process number 1, as the athlete does more exercise, they become in better and better physical condition. But as they do more exercise, their body wears out. So they have to time it so they are at peak ability when they come to the Olympics. Okay, and it's exactly the same with a patent. The question is, when do you want your patent to be at the peak quality? And what exactly does it mean that your patent is at peak quality? So there's 4 concepts I'm going to talk about today. One of them is that IP is fragile. We all know that. It's very easy to make one stupid mistake and your patent has no value. It's true about other types of IP as well. There's the issue of being adaptive, which means as circumstances change, we adapt the IP in order to match the circumstances. There's being resilient, which means that even though the examiner finds prior art and gives you a stupid rejection and so on, you still manage to keep the patent on course. And there's a concept of antifragile, which I'll talk about later, but basically it means that the patent gets better in time. In other words, peak patent is not when we file it, but later, somehow. So again, I'm going to talk about 4 mindsets. The first one is a one-shot mindset. It says, I wrote a patent, we're going to file it and see what happens. Anybody who watched Hamilton or listened to the songs, I'm not going to waste my shot. Okay, you have one shot and you're going to do it as you should, you're not going to waste it. And the basic concept that you have to think about is how much does the patent cost and what is the potential advantage? The patent office is a judge who's judging your patent, and the patent attorney, in other words, us, are like the kid, the Dutch story about the dike that had a hole in it and the kid stuck in a finger and saved the village. So that's really what the patent attorney is doing. Every time there's a new piece of prior art, you stick your finger in it, then another rejection, you stick your toe in it, and so on. And in this case, you say, we're very lucky we have a portfolio of patents, because this one patent, never would have made it. If you want to be a little bit more, let's call it open-minded and willing to spend more money, then we prepare a great application with fallbacks and alternatives. And then we expect that as we run through the gauntlet, some of these features and fallbacks and alternatives will be knocked out by the examiner, but some of them will stay. In fact, it's quite common for a patent attorney to give client a set of claims and say, claim 1 is broad, claim 3 is what I think we deserve, claim 5 is what I want, and claim 7 I think will survive anything the examiner can send, and it has some value. Okay, I'm sure you've all familiar with this mindset. Second mindset is adaptive mindset. And the adaptive mindset is Darwinian. And you're saying filing is the starting point, and as the examiner gives us new prior art, we're going to adapt the patent to match the prior art, to match changes in design. And the question we keep on asking is, how do I roll with the blow? Not how do I resist it, but how do I roll? You punch me, okay, I move sideways, like water. And if you want to be a bit biological, the patent office applies evolutionary pressure, and the patent attorney is a selfish gene. We want to propagate. The problem we need to think about all the time, there is such a thing as an evolutionary dead end. You become fitter and fitter and fitter, and suddenly the niche disappears and you're dead. And this means that if your patent doesn't have enough meat, and by meat, I mean ability to be flexible, then your patent could die from lack of fitness before it's granted. And the smaller the patent, the fewer words that it has, the more common that this is. And that's a reason, of course, to write more words in a patent. The more words you have, if you do them correctly, you're more likely to be able to adapt to what comes at you. Now, just to be clear, adapting is not the same as being resilient. And we'll see it in a minute. And remember, the fact that you got a patent, it's adapted to the world, but it might not be adapted to what the client needs. It's life. Another mindset is a swordsmith. I mean, I'm sure you've all seen movies where you take a piece of iron and you beat it, and then you fold it, and then you beat it again. And if any of you wondered why it's done, so one of the main reasons why it's done is because the type of iron they used to have then was full of impurities. When you beat the iron, the surface area goes up and the impurities get to the surface. And when you fold it, you spread the impurities over the entire iron so you don't have weak spots. So in a sense, the process of prosecution purifies your patent. It eliminates your weak spots. Like an examiner told me, your client should be happy that I'm giving you another rejection, because it means that when you get to court, your patent will be stronger. Okay, so it's a mindset that says the prosecution is eliminating the weak spots and it's purifying, and we know what we're looking at. And then, of course, when the patent is granted, that's when you have peak patent because you finished beating it up. So here's a patent office is a hammer and anvil, and the patent attorney is a smith who decides, what to do. Remember, not all impurity is removed that way. It's a lot of work. And the highlight of what's happening here is, you want to make a sword. Okay? The swordsmith is not just taking iron and beating it for the fun of it. He knows what he wants to make, which you might as well. And last, we have the anti-fragile mindset. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept of anti-fragility. It was made popular by Nassim Taleb, he of the Black Swan. And I have here a nice quote from Wikipedia. And basically, anti-fragility is a property of systems in which they increase in capacity to thrive, okay? Thrive as a result of stresses, shocks, volatility, noise, mistakes, attacks, or failures. Okay, so it's similar to the swordsmith, but not quite. Why? The swordsmith knows that he wants to make a sword, but maybe that's not what the client needs. The adaptive doesn't know what he wants to make, and maybe that's what he's going to get. In anti-fragile, we might not know what the goal is, but we do have a vision of making a product which increases its capability to help the client. Unlike the adaptive mindset, we don't know exactly what bad things might happen. In any case, the patent application we assume is good, but we know it can be made better. How do we make it better? By meeting with the world, by having these stressors, shocks, and so on. And what's interesting is each time you have one of these meetings, it helps you know what to do in a later meeting. Maybe not for this patent. You have a portfolio. Last but not least, peak patent is not the same as peak non-fragility. I use the word non-fragility because that includes resilience as well. So I built an anti-fragile patent. At some point, it's not anti-fragile anymore, but it might continue getting better. And I'll say a word about it. Here's a little bit of organization. The horizontal axis is a goal. Do I know what it is? Goal means, why are we writing the patent? Here, I know why we're writing the patent. And here, maybe I knew why I was writing the patent, but now my goals are changing. Constraints. Maybe I know all of them ahead of time, and maybe I don't. So we did a search. We found all of the relevant prior art. We know what we want the patent to cover. That's one shot. Okay, we don't have to play around. We know what's going to happen. We know what we want. We draft the best possible patent. Bam. Adaptive. We know what prior art they might give us. We can prepare for the prior art, but we're not exactly sure what the client's product is going to look like and what exactly we need to protect. So we need to use an adaptive mindset, both during drafting and during prosecution. Swordsmith is the opposite. We know what our goal is, but we're not sure what constraints are going to happen. It means that every time we do an activity with the patent office, what we're trying to do is to purify the patent. And anti-fragile is perhaps a mindset which is good when we don't know what's going to happen and we don't know exactly where we want to go. So instead of misadapting to something useless, we try to build a patent which is more and more capable as we find new prior art. Let me give you an example that is less common today. PCT filing used to be good and cheap. And that meant that we would sometimes file a first application in the PCT, get a good search before the 1 year was up, and based on what we found on the search, we would learn more about what we need and what constraints we have out there, and we could make the patent better. Today, it's still possible to do it. Various countries allow you to have fast prosecution, but it's not as, stable as it used to be with the PCT process. Obvious question, which one should we do? I just want to make it clear. Any one of these can be a suitable mindset to use during prosecution. Ask yourself, do you know where you're going? Do you know what you think is going to happen along the way? We know that we can't add anything to patent application once filed, except in a very small number of countries. And therefore, the anti-fragility is going to peak at some point. Every time you pivot the application to a different invention, you cut out options and you have fewer fallbacks left out, but the next patent can benefit. If I have to look at the process holistically, I'm doing two things simultaneously. I'm learning and I'm trying to avoid dead-ending the application unless indeed the application has no value. Now, a few tips. Some countries are more important. Some countries are more prone to dead ends. China and Brazil have a process where it's very easy to get to a dead end. When you draft the patent application, you need to take into account that you will need to learn. I think swordsmithing in general has the greatest potential because if you have a goal, you can draft your patent around that goal, but it could be that that goal is unachievable or that by the time you get it, it's useless. So it's not always the correct answer. Let's talk for a second about anti-fragile applications. That's, I think, the most unusual concept here. So if you read this article here at the end, which talks about anti-fragility in R&D, they have some pointers. I think the interesting one is a change in the mindset. Usually when we draft a patent application, the patent application is a single document which has everything it needs inside. In fact, that's what we're taught. Don't use external definitions, don't use references, write it as a whole. But in anti-fragility, we're assuming that good things, especially information flows, are expected to come from outside. Just as an example, new technology will arrive, and you have no idea what it is, but your patent should still cover it, and you have to expect that. Now, a patent is never anti-fragile on its own. It's part of a system, which includes, I don't know, the market, competitors, prior art. A few more pointers from this article, which I've modified for what we're doing. Optionality, which we've talked about before, basically means I can do A, or I can do B, or I can do C. But what's very important in anti-fragile processes is also switching from one track to a different track. So during prosecution, you have to decide when you're going to switch. For example, file a divisional with different claims. But also you have to draft it in a way which allows you to switch. When you choose which embodiments to put in the application, you don't just put them in order to make the application robust. You put them in order to make the application anti-fragile. What does that mean? If you have low probability events, you have to decide when you're drafting how much support you're going to provide in order to give you the option, let's call it, to pivot to these things. What that usually means is the patent application includes not only goals and features, but also semi-final goals, which are less likely to change, and partial consequences, which are more likely to happen. And I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, this sounds a little bit like a mess. You have to do this and this and this and this and this. Yes, it's a mess. But a patent application cannot be a mess. A patent application has to be coherent. Otherwise, you won't be able to write it, client won't be able to approve it, and the examiner will not be able to accept it. So I'm reminding you that in spite of all of these big words about options and anti-fragile and changing in external information flows, you need the application to be coherent. Now, the coherence does not need to come from a patentable feature. For example, the application can be coherent because it talks about a problem, about a solution, about some sort of story, some sort of insight, or maybe more than one of these, but it still needs to be coherent. So if you followed everything I said, but you didn't make a coherent application, it will probably be fragile rather than anti-fragile. It's very common for us in prosecuting in the European Patent Office. We give them a 50-page application, and the Patent Office insists on looking at each embodiment independently. So let's just assume each embodiment is 2 pages. So we have 25 embodiments, and the European Patent Office, instead of looking at it as a 50-page application, tells us choose one of these 25 2-page applications. You can imagine that that is not a very good situation to be in. If you have the right kind of coherence, you're more likely to have one 50-page application instead of 25 2-page applications. Any case, while you're drafting, you keep on asking, does the application include all of the stuff it's going to need? And of course, you have to prosecute. I don't know if you're familiar with this concept of ergodic and non-ergodic processes. Putting aside mathematics, the question is, does the order in which you do things matter? And in prosecution, the order in which you do things matters. For example, if the application dies, it stays dead. In addition, the funnels. I mentioned Brazil and China earlier. Europe also has some funnels. The limits on what you can undo, the examiner expects things once you go in one direction. If you try going in the other direction, it might never happen. You can run out of money. What that means that in order to prosecute, you have to know what the risks are, you have to order them. And by risk, I mean something that you need to learn from. This is not the learning and IP experiments I talked about a few weeks ago. It's about learning for this application or for the next one in the chain, what can work and what can't work. You must be sensitive to opportunities. For example, what if we suddenly have an opportunity to have the patent office say something positive about the IP? That's wonderful. We can show that to investors. How about having the patent office explain the art in a way that's good for us? That's also wonderful. That gives us an objective position on why the prior art is not relevant. And therefore, the leading question is, how will this, meaning what happened and what we want to do, how will it make the IP better? Okay, not how will I still get a patent, but how will the patent after this office action be better than the patent before this office action? I don't know how many of you ask yourselves that question. I know I try to, but I usually think about it only with respect to what the client needs, and not with respect to how the patent will now be more resistant to office actions or whatnot. And I said before, we have a portfolio. Sometimes anti-fragility comes from a balance between different parts of portfolio. So we can have different types of patents. And just to give you a particular example, when you have something which you're protecting both using a patent and using a trade secret, that gives you a measure of resilience and perhaps anti-fragility. Because when you see what you can get protection on, you understand using a patent, you understand better how you should be protecting your trade secrets. When you see what it is that people are having trouble copying from you, you now know what you should be protecting better or differently using your patents. Okay, so we're not going to talk about our widgets now because we're nearly out of time. I'm going to stop the recording now.